Mm.
All right, well, welcome today to the audience. My name is Keith Luse. I'm with the National Committee on North Korea. We're pleased that you're able to be with us as Frank Jannuzi, Sharon Squassoni, and I have a conversation with Dr. Siegfried Hecker about his recent book, Hinge Points, an insider's look at North Korea's nuclear program. At this point in time, I'd like to turn over to Frank Jannuzi, President and CEO of the Mansfield Foundation, which is a co-host for this event. Frank?
Well, thank you, Keith. It's a pleasure to join you and the members of the National Committee on North Korea audience from, I think, around the world for this conversation with our mutual friend and colleague, Dr. Siegfried Hecker. Here at the Mansfield Foundation, we're really proud to partner with NCNK and admire your work, Keith, there in leading that organization, which explores principled engagement with the DPRK and tries to convey accurate information about North Korea to the American public and to policymakers. It aligns nicely with the mission here at the Mansfield Foundation to promote mutual understanding and cooperation between the U.S. and our partners in Asia. So we're really delighted to have this special opportunity to hear from Dr. Hecker and hear especially about his new book, Hinge Points. I won't give an exhaustive introduction to Sig, but I want to just touch on a couple of highlights. He was born in Poland, came to the United States after World War II, and studied metallurgy and nuclear science at Case Western Reserve University, where he got both his BS and his PhD. He is perhaps best known professionally for his tenure as the director of Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratories for better than a decade, from 1986 until 1997. And is widely recognized around the world as one of the premier scientific experts on plutonium, plutonium production and nuclear weapons issues, including non-proliferation. But what I think is so remarkable about Sig Hecker is that in addition to being a scientist of renown and recognized accomplishment as a member of the National Academy of Engineering, he also is, frankly, a skilled international diplomat. I learned just today that he's made more than 35 trips to China. He has traveled extensively to North Korea, the subject largely of today's book talk, Hinge Points, although he also draws on his experience with the Chinese in that book, but also to places like Kazakhstan. And in his service to international peace and nonproliferation and mutual understanding on nuclear issues, he has been a voice of objectivity, reason, and fact-based analysis, and a trusted advisor to several US administrations. So not only a scientist, but a scholar diplomat. And so we're really delighted to be able to have this conversation with Sig today, and also delighted to be joined by my friend and colleague Sharon Squassoni, herself a renowned international expert on nuclear nonproliferation issues, and she'll have a chance to introduce herself more and be a part of this conversation. But I want to turn at this point to Sig Hecker. He's going to give us a brief overview of some of the key findings from his book, Hinge Points, and then we'll have a conversation, and we invite your questions from the audience. Please put them down in the chat box or the Q&A function, where Keith and I will try to field them and pass them on to Dr. Hecker. Without further ado, Sig, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank and Keith and Sharon. Thanks for this opportunity. So I'm going to talk about North Korea. So that's a place I never expected nor wanted to go to. Frank had mentioned I've been to China many times. I've been to Russia even many more times than that. But I didn't expect to go to North Korea. But it was my colleague, John Lewis, Professor John Lewis at Stanford, who took me to North Korea in 2004 for my first time. John is no longer with us, but I actually dedicated the book to John, because without John, for me, there would have been no North Korea. However, since 2004, it's been a preoccupation of mine. And so I want to make three 3 points up front and then open it up in conversation with the three of you and to Q's and A's. And that is sort of first the plan of the book. What inspired it, what was it about? Second, I want to focus on what I call the dual track strategy, which is what I believe that North Korea has followed for the last 30 years. And then third, how I get to the hinge points and what they mean. So the plan was indeed inspired by my 7 visits to North Korea. They gave me such remarkable access to their nuclear facilities, to their nuclear experts. For example, I wound up, Frank and Keith, as you well know, holding their plutonium in my hands. We talked to them shortly after the first nuclear test, and then my colleagues and I were there when they showed us the uranium enrichment facility. So they gave us enormous access to the technical people, but also to very high-level political people, vice ministers and down. And then for my part, thanks to the fact that I went with various very experienced people in the diplomacy arena, and that is John Lewis, also Jack Pritchard, Bob Carlin, and of course the two of you on my first trip to North Korea in 2004. So I benefited enormously from the wisdom, from being in the same room with these people and with the North Koreans. So let me say up front, and this isn't just an ad for the book, but I must say to really get what I want to bring across is you have to read the book because so much of it is in the details of the discussions with the North Koreans. For example, the technical people, you'll be blown over when you read about me discussing the phases of plutonium and the densities of plutonium, and the chemical processes to extract the plutonium. And then with the diplomatic people, their candor. And so in the end, it turns out that much like what I've learned in Russia and China, the diplomats and the technical people are indeed very, very skilled. And so the book then is inspired by those visits. It's supported by the outstanding research team that I had at Stanford, and particularly first and foremost, my former research assistant, Elliot Serban, who is out there somewhere in the chat land. Elliot helped me to do an enormous amount of the research. And since he's not a technical guy like I am, he actually knows how to write. And so that helped a lot, and Elliot was essential. I also benefited enormously by people in the other countries that have an interest in North Korea, that is South Korea, Russia, China, and by the US government, because Frank, as you pointed out, I did have association with all of the administrations. And since I'm scientist, not Republican or Democrat, I tried to help all of them. And of course, the book, as I point out there, I went as a non-governmental, non-official visitor because I'd already left Los Alamos. And by that time, after the first visit, I was at Stanford. And so what I try to do in the book is sort of take the reader along on this complex journey of tracking the North's nuclear developments within the overall the overall picture of the political developments. And so I look and bring along how these two sort of fed into each other. And that then in turn really convinced me that North Korea's policy, as I looked and tracked the diplomatic and political developments, was not just nuclearization, that means, building the bomb, but it was nuclearization and diplomacy. It wasn't one or the other, it was both. And so in other words, it was a dual track strategy. And so I concluded that they followed this dual track strategy sort of variously emphasizing one or the other, depending on whichever way the external situation, the domestic situation, but they never completely abandoned either. And that's what I detail in the book. And so my visits, the technical discussions, diplomatic discussions, my own analysis over these last 30 years convinced me that the three Kims, all three of them, had pursued diplomacy seriously. And that is seeking normalization, or let's say sort of a strategic accommodation with the United States. And that's one of the critical points I make in the book. I also realize that this crucial point is one on which the U.S. National security, diplomatic community is deeply divided. And so in the book, I try to explain how I became convinced that at key times they pursued diplomacy that offered real possibilities. That strategy, in my opinion, was formulated first by Kim Il-sung as the Cold War was coming to an end and North Korea faced a very new and uncertain world. And Kim saw this course as vital to improving his country's external security situation. And that meant achieving a regime security through rapprochement with the United States, essentially their main adversary, something that could provide sort of breathing room for North Korea to develop its own economy and to slip out from under China's shadow. And then I maintain, and I try to demonstrate that in the book, that his son and his grandson likewise at times turned to the same approach, and that is serious diplomacy, although, of course, under very different circumstances because the world continued to evolve. So let me also add to that, though, as though they were seeking diplomacy through strength, they very much believed, seeking diplomacy seriously, they very much believed to do that from a position of strength. And that actually explains sort of many of the actions that North Korea has taken over the years. And I maintain and try to demonstrate that the Bush, the Obama, and the Trump administration failed to see, much less cope effectively with that strategy. And so Washington, over all those years, had this fixed belief that Pyongyang pursued diplomacy to buy time and resources from the U.S. to advance its nuclear arsenal. That's what it was after. That meant even when Washington did engage, I thought it did so sort of half-heartedly at best, and it was usually riddled with doubt, and of course, lots of arguments within Washington, and it was never kept there long enough or effective enough to really bear fruit. So that was true for all three administrations. So again, let me stress that you have to read the book and to follow the North journey to convince you that those diplomatic opportunities actually existed. As an example, I try to point out the remarkable, as I said, remarkable access that they gave me to facilities and the people. And if you think about it, why in the world in 2004 would they allow me to hold the plutonium? What's the message they were trying to get across? Why in 2006 were John Lewis, Bob Carlin, and I there 2 weeks after their first nuclear test? It's one that didn't work so well. What message, what were they trying to get across, and why in 2010 would they show us this modern centrifuge facility, which they had denied they had ever built? And actually, that one was so interesting because as we were walking up the steps, the chief process engineer actually said, we did not want to show you this facility, but my superiors made us do it. And the reason you don't show those facilities, you don't show other countries your facilities. Again, unless you're there to try to accomplish something else. And I think that accomplishing something else was to show that the U.S., that they were serious, that they had great capabilities, and they wanted the United States to be serious about dialogue and to address their concerns. In other words, it was a push to diplomacy. So, in the end then, as I looked at the US administrations, those doors were sometimes open, they failed to go through it, and almost in every case where the opportunities were there, those opportunities were squandered. And so the misguided assumptions, the deep suspicions of these last three administrations about North Korea repeatedly caused all three to miss those opportunities whenever Pyongyang was serious about the diplomatic track. And so I also, by the way, in the book, I not only track when North Korea was developing its hedges along the dual track, and I also point out where North Korea missed the mark. If they were really serious about diplomacy, why did at certain times did they just have to sort of turn the screw, and launch a satellite when it may have been better off to wait? Okay, so let me get to Hinge Points. So that dual track strategy, then what it did bring a steady stream of nuclear advances. And it's very clear as I developed this, over these last 20 some years, that when we were talking to them, the advances were slower. When we were not talking to them, then sort of, all doors were open and they advanced, very rapidly. And so when they did advance, then that brought us to these decision points, to hinge points. And that's where I then demonstrate is what happened there is the US took an approach of trying to bring the risk to zero instead of managing the risk, instead of making technically informed risk management decisions. They didn't. Thus caused the wrong decisions at hinge points. So hinge points are places where bad decisions have bad consequences. And so Washington wound up with exactly the opposite of what it wanted. And the North was handed more opportunities to expand its programs. So I'm just going to briefly point out sort of three, major hinge points. The first one was 2002, when the Bush administration killed the agreed framework. And I won't give you all of the background associated with it. Most of you know it. And I do cover enough of that. And the essence was that essentially what the administration said is when it found out that North Korea was pursuing covertly a uranium enrichment program while it had frozen the plutonium path to the bomb, for at that time for 8 years, that was enough to walk away from the agreed framework. Actually, John Bolton said it was the hammer that he needed to shatter the agreed framework. Okay, so they did. Well, it turns out the Clinton administration already knew they were doing some uranium enrichment on the side. But this decision was such a poor decision from a standpoint of being not technically informed, because what was done is they gave away a clear path for North Korea to restart the plutonium facilities, build the bomb in 6 months to a year or so, because they were worried about uranium enrichment, which was at least another 5, most likely like 10 years away before being able to build the bomb. And so that's a hinge point. It's a poor decision. And what it caused, of course, the North Koreans opened the complex back up. They went ahead and built the bomb. And then by 2006, they tested the bomb. But the hinge points wasn't just the Bush administration or the Trump administration, it was the Obama administration. And actually, I find myself, as I go back and read the book, that's some of the most interesting chapters, because I wouldn't have expected the Obama administration to deal so poorly with North Korea, but it did. The hinge points there were, as soon as President Obama came in, North Koreans launched a satellite. And that essentially, by that time, the Bush administration had actually gone into a diplomatic mode. They had people back in North Korea. The IAEA was back in North Korea. And when they then launched the satellite, then the Obama administration walked away. North Koreans went ahead and chased the inspectors back out. They did a second test, and that one worked. But that reaction from the Obama administration, again, was not technically informed. Of course, you can learn something about missiles from satellite launches, but if you looked at the trade-off of giving the North Koreans green light again in their nuclear facilities and to go test, it was not the right thing. The same thing was done with the so-called leap day deal in 2012. And then the last hinge point that I mentioned it just briefly, and that's one that I, in my opinion, really takes careful reading of the book, because I try to put the pieces together of what was really there. And it wasn't as simple as it's made out in the news media, that the North Koreans, had a deal for Trump, but they were only going to give him part of this old facility at Yongbyon, and that Trump was right to walk away from that deal and not to relieve all their sanctions, although that wasn't exactly what was there. But if you read the book carefully, you find out just how much Kim had offered up in his letters to Trump, and what an opportunity Hanoi was. And somebody at Hanoi, as Trump started, should have said, hey, wait a minute, let's do this differently. Trump should have, but again, in this case, John Bolton had him very well prepared to walk away. But this is also the place where the North Koreans made a mistake, in my opinion. In the walk up to Hanoi, they should have worked with Steve Biegun, the special envoy. They should have, laid out a number of these things. They should have talked about the things that Kim had offered, in his letters, such as shutting down the Nuclear Weapons Institute. So that was all unfortunate. Those are just some of the examples. Again, I encourage you to read the book. Let me just wind up with probably the part that people are most interested in. That is what happens now. Well, that's not what I'm here to discuss today, but let me just give you the bad news. Is that whereas I try to make the point in the book, as I said, the North Koreans were really serious about diplomacy all along, and at various times, each one of the Kims stepped in, and we may be at the end of that. And that's all the indications since sort of after Hanoi had already started going downhill, and by February a year ago, with the Xi-Putin summit, and then the Kim declarations afterwards, all the way to the latest one from his sister a couple of days ago, supporting Russia, we may be at a point where Kim has actually decided it's no longer in their interest to pursue strategic accommodation with the United States. I wouldn't give up all the way, because we've been in bad times before, but it's going to be tough. Thanks. I'll stop there. I went a little longer than I had anticipated.
Sig, thank you so much. Sharon, we'll turn to you.
Well, thank you. First of all, to the National Committee on North Korea and also the Mansfield Foundation. Not only did I get to read this book, but we get to have this conversation. So I honestly, I should just invite you to dinner, Sig, and sort of poke you for all the details. But there are fantastic details in this book. And I guess I just want to start with saying, we're really indebted to you. You retired from public service, and but your curiosity and your commitment to scientific collaboration, and just, I would say, if there was a U.S. secret weapon, it's your integrity in dealing with these North Koreans, which really comes through in these pages, that I think made a big difference. Just a couple of points to start us off. I never put together the Chinese connection, the fact that after your trips, you were able to have conversations with those scientists. That to me is completely fascinating. And I hope at some point in the future that we hear more about that. But that your ability to sort of connect the dots across nuclear weapons programs, also all the work that you did with the Russians, is really astounding. When I sit back and look at all of this, in a lot of ways, the North Koreans were brilliant. What a brilliant idea to have you go. Because who else would be able to sort of thread the needle so carefully, right? To both kind of, you know, have a good technical assessment of what they were telling you, but also because of all your experience, you know, not giving away the store, right? My experience, the one time I was in North Korea, it was very clear to me that my interlocutors, they were incredibly well briefed. They knew a lot about certain things, but there were blind spots, there were gaps. And so my question to you is, in talking about these technical things, how hard was it for you to gauge how much they knew? You know, like you as a, you know, somebody with a clearance, or I don't know whether it was probably still current then, but, you know, how do you walk that line of sort of getting the information from them, but not revealing too much?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good question. And indeed, you know, we had discussions about plutonium density, you know, plutonium phases and the casting of plutonium. And actually, Frank and Keith were both there. You know, they were sitting in this conference room, and I'm sure you must have been mortified when they brought in the plutonium. But it turns out, you know, for the rest of the viewers out there who are not the technical experts, if you put plutonium in a glass jar and you make sure that the top is sealed, that radiation that one worried about doesn't get out. So it was not a problem. So it turns out I never really had the problem with them that I would reveal things from our side. And so there, the situation was more, I was more interested in how much are they willing to tell me. This was just, it was a back and forth. And what was really important, and the book says that, both I say it and Vice Minister Kim Gae-gwan says it, that I'm not there as an inspector. So that's really a key point. It was a key point in my relationship with them. You know, with an inspector, you're never too crazy about having an inspector in your house or in your place because they look for stuff. And so I wasn't an inspector, so they were sharing information. And so the most interesting part was how they shared the information with me. And the way that it went, and this what gave me such enormous respect for their technical people, especially Director Lee Hong-sup. He was so skilled at this. So the way that I viewed it is politically, when they had decided that they would go ahead, you know, they had invited John Lewis. They didn't invite me to come in 2000. They invited John Lewis. And John is the one that invited me. I didn't want to go to North Korea, as I say in the book. And so I was sure that somebody in the US government or in their government would say, heavens, no, we're going to not the former director of Los Alamos in here. But instead, they had exactly the opposite reaction and said, ooh, this really gives us an opportunity. We can get the message across. So the political people must have told them, here's the envelope of what you can tell them. And you tell them everything inside of that envelope, you know, in terms of the plutonium, the reactors, the things we do. You tell them, you make sure that they understand that we understand this stuff about the nuclear business. But if he gets to a sensitive part of that envelope, then you tell him he can't go there. And so as Frank and Keith know, I got to that part about 3 or 4 times where I asked questions, for example, about the isotopics of the plutonium, which would give you an idea as to how long it had been in the reactor and how good it is for a bomb. And I asked that question 3 different times. And the third time, Director Lee Hong said, I already told you I'm not authorized to tell you that. And so that was a fascinating visit and discussion. And then each one of them were like that. When I came to the nuclear testing discussion in 2006, there again, I met with Director Lee Hong-sup, and he just basically told me he wasn't going to tell me anything about the nuclear testing. I finally got one thing out of him, and again, it's not that I was not prying classified information. I just tried to understand. What do they know? What do they understand? And he finally did admit that they have their own, they have the standard way of determining the yield of their test. And again, that test was particularly low. And he told me how they did that. But the rest of it, it was fascinating discussion. If I can, just for a second, and I won't go into much detail, but the China connection was really helpful here. And it turns out the Chinese nuclear people, the nuclear people I dealt with were my counterparts. So I've been at the China nuclear weapons complex in their laboratory. I went when I was director of Los Alamos. Their director at the time is one I've met with every time I've gone into and then come out of North Korea. And so they also the nuclear people don't like the North Koreans building the bomb. They really don't like the North Koreans testing the bomb. And so we had these very, very good discussions. We had great respect for each other. And the most important thing to learn from them is they had some insights into the North Korean program that I did not have. And the reason for that is here in the US, we've had this, huge program over all of these years. The Chinese program was very, very different. It started on shoestrings, was much more like the North Korean program was. So they often told me, don't mirror image their program after yours, mirror image it after ours. I'll stop there.
So Sig, just to follow up on some of this before I turn to Frank. Sig, it's interesting that the 2004 visit was a year or so after the US invasion of Iraq. And there was talk at the time that Kim Jong-il was concerned about the US invasion of Iraq, and whether it was Kim Jong-il in North Korea or Tan Shui in Burma and on and on, there was reportedly this concern by the North Koreans that they might be next. And so the question becomes, in your mind, to what degree was allowing us into the facility at Yongbyon, to what degree was that connected to a North Korean calculation that, by golly, if we just let these Americans in and if we talk to them, that hopefully would prevent some sort of invasion, that would give us more time, et cetera, et cetera. I was amazed, as you and Frank, in the sense of on one hand, the reluctance of Director Rhee and his colleagues to answer questions, but on the other hand, they answered them. And it was clear that they were under orders to do so. So at the end of the day, let's just parse this a little more. What was Kim Jong-il's thinking in instructing them to be so transparent?
Oh, heavens, Keith, the answer is, I don't know what his thinking was. I mean, that's much, much too complicated. But you and I were there, and then I was there, many other times, where these issues, like the ones you raise, come up. The one that you raise here is one that's really timely. 2003, Iraq, they're making big decisions at that time. And then, of course, we visit. The invitation was given to John Luse in late October of 2003. So it was right in that same time. So let me try to answer. From my standpoint, I don't think that had much to do with it. I've heard the North Koreans many times, they would talk about Iraq. They would talk particularly about Libya. That was even much more favorite topic for them, sort of saying, Libya gave up its nuclear weapons and look what happened to them. And then, of course, Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons and look what happened to them. And so their diplomatic people, were sure to get that message in, how serious that was and how they dealt with the United States. I'm not sure. My gut instinct is, I don't think it had much to do with that. I think their view, my own view from North Korean standpoint, they've demonstrated all along, and this is actually something that Bob Carlin has spent a lot of time studying, and that's their economy. They have been very concerned to try to bring their economy along for a long, long time, and especially, of course, after those devastating 1990s, that they had. So they have focused on the economy. They know they need the economy. And I think they actually realize their major threat is internal. And somehow they got to make the lives of the North Koreans better. They got to look at the economy. And so that connection with the US is also an economic connection. I think also as they look at South Korea, it is. I think those are the things that are much more important. The US connection, trying to come sort of accommodation with the US in order to take the external security environment, to a point where they can go ahead and pay attention to the economy. And of course, if you look back, I mean, that's what China did. China got it didn't really build up the economy until it really got its external security environment to where they could pay more attention to the economy. But quite frankly, I just told you more than I know, but that's my response.
All right, Frank. And then, by the way, just a reminder to the audience to submit your questions, the Q&A. Frank, go ahead.
Thank you, Keith. Sig, let me dig a little deeper into this hinge point of 2002, which in my mind extends well into 2003 and the first DPRK reprocessing run of significance at Yongbyon. You and I and Keith, John Lewis, saw the fruits of that reprocessing run when we visited in 2004. And my recollection is that having toured the facility, and you rightly pointed out, you weren't there as an inspector, and yet the access that we were afforded was quite remarkable. At one point, you asked to please take the lid off of some of the spent fuel storage canisters in the spent fuel pond, because you wanted to be persuaded that they were in fact empty of spent fuel rods, and the North Koreans agreed. And at another point during the visit, my recollection is you asked specifically to see some product, some plutonium product, and the answer was forthcoming. Yes, we can do that, and they brought forward the sample that you later held in your hands. But I want to focus in on that evening when we got back to Pyongyang, because at one point you asked the DPRK negotiator Kim Gae-gwan a question. He had just said to you, now you've seen our nuclear deterrent. And my recollection is you've sort of responded, well, not so much, sir. You've persuaded us that you know how to reprocess plutonium, but a deterrent involves delivery systems, weapons. I can't go back to Washington and report that I've seen a DPRK nuclear deterrent. How does that make you feel? And Kim Gae-gwan sort of gave a rather gruff response. I asked the question, you point out that the North Korean program has these dual purposes and that there's the goal of showing strength. What, in your assessment now, 15 years later from that first visit, was your visit designed to give them a chance to show some strength? Was that part of their hope, do you think, that they could demonstrate their progress as a deterrent against possible action, as Keith was hinting at from Iraq war lessons? Maybe I'm asking you to speculate too much about their leadership, but how do you interpret various North Korean efforts over the years to signal strength, and yet still conclude that doesn't mean that they've walled off the hope for possible negotiations or reconciliation with the U.S.?
Well, Frank, let's see. I sort of I think that's about 7 questions that you asked. So let me see if I can walk through that. In terms of signaling their strength. Yeah, I think clearly the stuff they've shown us, and then my last of the 7 visits was 2010, and then after that. They started showing things on KCNA, through the visits to the various factories, and then actually showing their bombs, their bomb designs, and of course the missiles and all of that. And all of those were aimed at showing their capabilities and their strength, as do the missile firings and the nuclear tests, show that without question. In the reason I think in 2003 they made decision for a 2004 visit is so the James Kelly visit in October of 2002, which essentially then progressed to the point where the Americans walked away and the deal was killed. So at that point, the North Koreans restart the nuclear complex. The North Koreans get busy on building the bomb. And by the way, I explain in the book that during the 90s, while they had the plutonium production frozen, they were sure doing lots of other things to make sure they could design a bomb and then actually be able to test the bomb. So they weren't sitting on their hands at that time. That was part of their dual track strategy. But if you think about it, so they restart the facility, they reprocess the plutonium. First, they leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and here they are in 2003, and nobody in Washington seems to give a damn. They're tied up in Iraq, as we were just saying. And so a good part, I think, of this visit was to say, look, Americans, pay attention. We've got the bomb. So that's the answer to that showing strength. Just a slight correction, Frank. It was Lee Gun, the ambassador, who I had the discussion with about a deterrent. He says, Dr. Hecker, we've now shown you our deterrent. And I did like I do with my classes at Stanford and now at Texas A&M and at Monterey, where I do some teaching now. I said it takes three things. It takes the bomb fuel, it takes weaponization, and it takes delivery. And I said, all you did was, as you just indicated, you showed me that, you made plutonium and it sure looks like you can extract it. And the stuff I saw, is reasonably impressive. But what about the other things? And then Lee Gun actually said at the end, as we were, I said, I would like to see the other parts. And he said, let me see what I could do. On Saturday morning, as we were pulling out, and I said, well, I didn't, you didn't show me any other parts. He said, well, we weren't able to do that, but ask for them next time. Okay. So next time in 2005, I come back and I say to Vice Minister Kim Gae-gwan, look, we had this discussion about seeing the other parts of the, he essentially said, you have to be kidding. We're not going to show you our bombs. Those are secret. We're not going to show, they never did show us the other part. But the main part of weaponization, of course, then came with 6 nuclear tests. So we don't know any of the details, but for heaven's sakes, they know, how to build a bomb. It's worked. And then the delivery, of course, they've shown us that over and over since that time. So I think I covered a few of your questions.
Thank you very much. Yes, you did.
All right, Sharon.
Oh my gosh, it's rapid fire here for you, Sig. Actually, for a technical guy, you write really well. There's this phrase in the book, I really liked it. You said, they need on this dual track, they needed nuclear weapons to survive and diplomacy to thrive, right? And that's, one of the key themes throughout the book. It kind of sidesteps the question, which you may not be able to answer. I certainly am not able to answer it, but that plagues everyone, which is, was North Korea ever serious about disarmament? And could they ever be serious again? There are many cases in which, they signed agreements, they committed to denuclearization. There's a big debate now about, should we just give this up as a policy objective? But I wonder, when you look at it, do you see any, my own theory is that, as their capabilities grow, it becomes harder and harder just from even a bureaucratic politics perspective, right? You have people, you now have institutes for nuclear weapons, you have doctrine, you have laws, so did, in your sort of reviewing these decades, are there certain points at which you thought they may have been more serious about it? I know that's a tough question, and you can just
No,
say.
no, that's good. No, Sharon, it's a very good question because indeed, many of the analysts, diplomats, and so forth, really in their gut believe that North Korea was never serious about giving up their nuclear weapons. Again, my view differs from that, and it differs based on these interactions with them, and it differs on tracking the technical nuclear advances or retractions. By the way, I didn't specifically say it, but Frank, as you know, when we were there, that what we found out is when they froze the plutonium program in the agreed framework, they froze the reactor, but they were smart enough to keep it such it could be restarted. But this reactor can make 1 bomb's worth of plutonium a year. They had 2 other reactors, which if they had finished, and believe me, if no one had gone in there, they would have eventually finished. They could have made 50 bombs worth or so per year. And those died. They died, and they have never been resurrected again. So was there anything good coming out of the agreed framework? No matter how you want to look at it, yes, they lost those 2 reactors. So at that time, Sharon, my view was during this time we were there in 2004 and sort of the end of the agreed framework, that's when we had by far the best chance. They didn't have the bomb yet, in my opinion. So it wouldn't have been denuclearizing and giving up the weapons, but it wouldn't giving up the rest. They didn't have uranium enrichment yet, anywhere close to where they could have made enriched uranium. So they really didn't have much. And we handed them on a silver platter by letting them go ahead and reprocess the spent fuel. And so now they had 25 to 30 kilograms of plutonium, maybe 5 bombs worth. And so all of a sudden now they had something, but still they weren't very far along. And that's the point. That was our best chance. And I didn't appreciate it at the time because I wasn't a student of North Korea. But the progress that had been made in working with the North Koreans in the Keto project it was incredible, not so much as to how much of the reactor was coming out of the ground, but the relationship that the Americans and the Keto program team made with the North Koreans. And what I mean when I say we didn't stay with the diplomatic track long enough is that's a great example. I mean, suppose they could have stayed with that long enough and they'd actually built and finished a 1,000 megawatt nuclear reactor that produced electricity for a good part of North Korea. And then would North Korea have pulled away? If we would have pulled the switch on that North Korea, the lights would have gone out. They would have had so much at stake that they would have had a totally different calculus as to whether they want to keep up a nuclear weapons program. And that same decision was made over and over and over. And as you just said, it's become more and more difficult. Quite frankly, after 2017, when they tested what was likely hydrogen bomb, and then they tested an ICBM, I thought the chances of even getting back into serious discussion was just about nil. But they did in 2018. They did. And Singapore, in my opinion, was a serious discussion. And then again, if you look at the Kim letters, what he was offering, what their dialogue going into Hanoi, I think they were again serious. Were they going, if Trump wouldn't have walked away, if they would have stayed there and said, okay, let's talk this out. Now, Chairman Kim, you talked about giving up the Nuclear Weapons Institute. Now tell me exactly, what do you mean by that? Because the Nuclear Weapons Institute, the best I can, it's their Los Alamos, okay, and their Livermore. If you give up Los Alamos and Livermore, you can give up the U.S. nuclear arsenal. You don't have an arsenal. So you have to have them. So he would have had to find out. Nobody went far enough to actually find out. And so he walked away. And so each time, whatever it would have taken longer to actually find out whether we can get there, would they have given everything up after Hanoi? Heavens, no. They would have first tried to see what exactly, how does this change their relationship with the United States? Do they get to where they want to get to? And so my view is we just haven't stuck it long enough. And technically, by the way, and that's the point I try to make in the book for each of those, technically, we could live whatever they were doing. So if they weren't giving up all of their whole nuclear weapons enterprise, I don't know it, that's okay at that time. If they shut down Yongbyon, they let us into that enrichment facility. We really find out how much they're doing on the uranium enrichment. We know what they're doing on plutonium. We don't know what they're doing in the uranium enrichment. You can't see in through the building. We could find out all of those things. We could have taken those risks. Technically, there's no question we could have taken those risks. But politically, the decisions were made otherwise.
Sig, thank you. Before we start turning to some questions that have been submitted to the audience, Sharon, do you have any follow-up to Sig's response to your question?
No, but I do have one question for you, which is,
go ahead.
Throughout your book, you talk about, after you made your, you would come back from North Korea and you would either give a presentation before Congress, or you would write an article, or you would, and then you would take whatever those public, documents were, and you would pass them to the North Koreans, kind of everything's above board. So my question is, have you sent them a copy of this book?
Oh, so the answer is no. I have not. I did send them, Sharon, as you point out. For example, the first one was especially important, and I need to give credit to Keith and to Frank, is they helped to set up the congressional testimony that I gave when we came back. And they set it up because Frank worked for Senator Biden and Keith for Senator Lugar. And so here you had the two guys, from Senate Foreign Relations. And when I put together my statement, I sent it to the North Koreans through the New York mission the night before. And then when I got to North Korea the next time, they said they very much appreciated that. And especially what they appreciated is that, as Keith and Frank know, the final night dinner, Kim Dae-gwan, the vice minister, was really interested in my report from Yongbyon and what I saw. I mean, so much so, he was taking notes himself. And what I told them, I said, look, I've put together all of my thoughts. I've got some notes, and I'm going to tell you everything I'm going to tell the US government when I get back there. And the next year he said, you said you're going to do that. And you did, and we really respect that. And so I think that was important. But I hadn't thought about sending the book to New York, or I don't know how to send it to Pyongyang. But by the way, I do have some copies on the way to my Chinese colleagues, and they've already said they're really waiting to see it, and they are sure it's going to be the best book ever on North Korea. So the Chinese and we have pretty, again, they're Chinese nuclear people, not necessarily they're political people, but they're nuclear people, have very similar views.
All right, so we'll turn back to Frank in a moment, but before doing so, I'd like to pull together two of the questions that have been submitted. So Sig, first, Randall Spadoni says, thank you. I've interacted with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in North Korea and have respect for many of their longstanding diplomats. However, I'm never sure how much power they actually have to negotiate or who has greatest influence over decisions. Who is key for the U.S. to build relationships with in the North going forward? So that's the first question. Secondly, we have a question about the roles that Russia and Mongolia may have played over time with North Korea. I think with Russia, more likely in the nuclear area. Mongolia, it's unlikely. So any comments you could provide on that front as well. So Sig, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not sure about who really is plugged in at the top level in North Korea. But judging from what we were able to do, the discussions we had, the places we were able to see, and when I asked, there was no question that Kim Jong-il, had authorized those visits and my return visits. So whoever we were dealing with, clearly had that sort of access. My own view was that certainly Kim Gae-kwan, the vice minister, certainly had to track into the main person, and namely Kim Jong-il at that time. We saw various, as you know, parliamentary people and others, and I think those were mostly for show and really didn't have any significant impact. I do also think now, after what I saw after the hydrogen bomb test, is that perhaps the nuclear people, like Dr. Lee Hong-sup, actually had good access and impact. Because after the hydrogen bomb, well, before the hydrogen bomb test and also before some of the others, it was Lee Hong-sup who was there on KCNA photos or videos explaining the bomb to Kim Jong-un, and this time. And then after the hydrogen bomb test in this huge auditorium with our, good Dr. Lee Hong-sup actually there in an army uniform with lots of medals on him, was being led into the room to applause, holding hands with Kim Jong-un. And I would imagine in order to hold hands with Kim Jong-un in that sort of an environment, you probably have some impact. But in the end, I'm really not so sure. They seemed to be, and I would say, later on, Vice Minister Liang Ho and Madam Che, who now is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I think Madam Che probably all along, and I met her on each one of my visits, she probably had good avenues into Kim Jong-il and then Kim Jong-un. As far as Russia and Mongolia, so I've been to Mongolia also on nuclear related things, but mostly nuclear energy related. And so I don't know, all I know is they've had a very good diplomatic relationship with each other, but I don't know anything beyond that. In Russia, and on the nuclear end, that relationship, of course, is long time and really important. And so let me just try to say it very briefly. But Russia's nuclear relationship with North Korea was that Russia helped North Korea establish a civilian nuclear research program, much like we helped Iran. Okay, so there's similar relationships. Atoms for Peace, they helped them with the civilian nuclear program. The Soviets actually, those were the Soviets. Soviets actually convinced North Korea to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And as one of the benefits of that, the Soviets were going to build them light water reactors before we ever had the Kido idea. But then, of course, the Soviet Union, collapsed and that went away. My view is, from talking about this extensively with the Russian nuclear people, that the Russian nuclear people never helped the North Koreans on any weapon-related activity. So the civilian, and of course you learn something about nuclear stuff that's benefit the weapons, but they did not support or help them with the nuclear weapons program. I cannot say that for the missile people. And in fact, there's enough evidence that, first of all, the Soviets, helped the North Koreans with missiles. The Scuds are based on Soviet technology, although apparently the North Koreans first got those from the Egyptians. But at any rate, after the Soviet Union dissolved, there appears to be lots of evidence of the Russian missile organization continuing to help North Korea all up, and possibly even to this day. That's not clear. So the missiles, yes. As far as the Russian diplomats or the Russian academics, the Russians really know a lot about North Korea. You get people like Andrei Lankov, a Russian who's now living in South Korea. I mean, he's been there, he went to school there. He really knows North Korea. Anton Klopkov, who's at one of the centers called CNES in Moscow, has continued to have very good relationships with the Russians. They've learned a lot, they've worked together. But again, in my opinion, in a very sort of constructive role. And it's not only, in the last year or so that role seems to have gotten destructive in terms of the relationship of North Korea with Russia and what it might mean in places like Ukraine. I hope I answered your question.
All right, Frank, let's turn to you. And then once you've posed a question and Sig's responded, we'll go back to questions from the audience. So Frank?
Thanks, Sig. I want to echo your thought that many Russians have deep knowledge about North Korea. Alexander Ilyachov, senior fellow of the Mansfield Foundation, is one of the viewers today, and I know he and many others of Russian origin have deep knowledge. And the reason I mention it is because one of the questions in the chat is kind of forward-looking with a pessimistic view, asking, who could write Hinge Point 2.0 20 years from now if we don't have the kind of access, engagement, dialogue, knowledge base of folks outside of North Korea to write that follow-on book. And my question, I guess, also is to ask you to put your crystal ball on the table in front of you a little bit. What do you think the next Hinge Point might look like? What are the sorts of events or drivers of the next critical hinge point in U.S. DPRK nuclear diplomacy?
So the first thing I think of, what sort of bad things could cause that hinge point, and right now, of course, there almost everything is going in the wrong direction. The Biden administration has said they've tried very hard to get to talk to the North Koreans, and the North Koreans won't answer the phone. And so I think early in the Biden administration, perhaps that could have been done differently. And indeed, for whatever it was worth, I sent my recommendations and thoughts into the Biden administration early, and essentially said, do something really quickly, because the tendency is always to do, a nuclear policy review, and that takes many, many months. And we thought that after Hanoi, things had to be done quickly, take bigger risks in terms of nuclear things, because again, in the nuclear arena, my view is on North Korea, too many people have pushed much too hard that North Korea should not have anything in the civilian arena. And I think, first of all, it's not that's unrealistic, and it's also terribly unhelpful. And so, for example, one of the things that I proposed is actually do something big. Tell the North Koreans, look, what we're interested in at this point is we just don't want denuclearization, whatever that means. What we want to do is what I call a military to civilian conversion, and to do it cooperatively. So we would actually work cooperatively so that you can have a research reactor, you can make medical isotopes, either we help you finish your reactor. But by the way, that reactor, that light water reactor that I saw coming out of the ground, along with Bob Carlin and John Lewis in 2010, That's got to be one of their biggest failures. I mean, here we are in 2023, and they still don't have that running. And so that's really quite surprising, especially when you compare it to the successes with the missile tests and with their nuclear tests. So there's something there that they don't have. They can't quite get together. Well, we could help them in that direction. Again, there are people in the United States who say, never, never, never should they have a light water reactor. And I say, well, that's the wrong way to go. So we could do something of that nature. Could something come up where perhaps they actually come back around? Things in Ukraine go really badly for the Russians. They start to rethink their Russia strategy. Perhaps with China, they never really, as you well know, they never did like the Chinese. They don't like to be under the Chinese thumb. Could there be some time where the North Koreans would actually sort of poke out and one could consider something like that? And then again, we make another decision. Absolutely not. That would be a hinge point. Another really bad hinge point, we get some sort of a confrontation in the West Sea. And U.S. takes action, and particularly, South Korea has been pretty aggressive in some of the things that they were done, and I could see that pushing us over a hinge point. That would be terribly unfortunate. So those are all the kinds of things that would happen. My view is right now it's still going to be very, very tough to get them to pay any attention, to want to get back into some sort of normalization with the U.S., but we should be prepared because North Koreans have demonstrated they're quick on their feet. And who after the fire and fury and all of that would have thought, and it was really Kim that came out of that first, by 2017. He was indicating that, look, he's interested. And then Trump did have the sense, to be willing to meet with him and at least open the door. Unfortunately, he never walked through the door.
Okay, thank you, Sig. Before turning to Sharon for any final comment or question Sharon might have, I'd like to share a couple of additional questions that have been submitted. Frank writes, Sig, given that certain aspects of U.S. diplomatic engagement with North Korea are classified and not available to the public as a whole, what sources do you use to determine whether the U.S. government at various points did indeed botch a hinge point? Do you rely on news accounts, open source information, interviews with former officials, or all of the above? Thank you. And then, Sig, you probably also know Andrew Whitley with the Elders, the group The Elders. Andrew writes, in 2013, when I was on the staff of the Elders, then chaired by Kofi Annan, I was asked by a diplomat from the DPRK mission to the UN if the Elders could help the North Koreans dispose of spent nuclear fuel rods. The query came completely out of the blue. Sadly, the Elders did not follow up or take the proposal seriously. Should we have done so? Those are the last two questions we'll submit from the audience. Sig?
Well, so did you say 2013 that date was?
Yes.
Okay. Let me answer that one first. In 2013. So that wasn't a legitimate question. There was nothing there to take care of. The North Koreans had walked away from the diplomacy. They walked away in 2009. They restarted the reactor. They were reprocessing as they needed it to go along. And I just cannot see that why anybody that knew anything about those reactors would have said, we want somebody to take a look at that. There's the only outside possibility would actually somebody got the spent nuclear fuel confused with nuclear waste from the spent nuclear fuel, because North Korea, the best as I know from my discussions with their technical people, has not done anything to permanently to treat that nuclear waste, and they need to do that at some point. So they might need help with that. But that's just not. That wasn't a legitimate question. I don't see that was a serious issue. I did, just as an aside, I had the chance to meet with the elders and be on stage with the elders, as Sharon knows, last week at the unveiling of the Doomsday Clock, because I chaired a board of sponsors for the Bulletin of the American Scientist, and so they wanted me there. And the elders were there, actually with the former president of Ireland, former president of Mongolia also. And so working something through the elders actually would have been an interesting, but that's the wrong problem. So the other question, is an excellent question to ask of someone like me. Did I use classified information along? The answer is no. And so I've made it a point that the classified information goes, or my dealing with the people who have the classified information goes in one direction, from me to them, and not from them to me. So I've made it a point not to go get classified briefings during these times. I've given briefings that have been in classified. When I came back, the first visit, I went over to the State Department and their intelligence bureau, and I briefed them. I've subsequently, briefed various other intelligence agencies about my trips. So what I do is I take the information that I have learned, and then, of course, I take all the open source information that I can get, all the open source dialogue in terms of what the U.S. has actually what the U.S. did with North Koreans. And so, as I mentioned before, I've been there with every one of the administrations on North Korea, starting with Bush, going to Obama, going to the Trump administration. I've had the opportunity all the way, up and down, from analysts and also to the National Security Council. So, for example, I met with Secretary Condi Rice when I come back from 2005 and another trip. And then I met with Secretary Hillary Clinton when I come back in 2010. I've met with Secretary Pompeo in the years during the Trump administration. And so I've dealt with them, I've shared information, I try to give as much information, and then, as was already pointed out, also Sharon pointed out, I've given lots of presentations. And so one of the reasons for the presentations is that, in the US, we tend to have these sort of prejudiced views about places we don't know. And so North Korea, is the hermit kingdom and the black hole to most people. And as you know, you two have been there, and I've been there, and Sharon's been there. It's not like that. And they're real people. And so I've taught about North Korea in my classes. I show the photos that I've taken. And by the way, this gives me the opportunity to make a plug for the website that we developed. My colleagues at Stanford helped me develop a website that goes with the book, that gives much more information, yet it doesn't tell the story of the book. That's for the book. Lots of photos, more technical stuff. And that website now is housed at the Center for Non-Proliferation Study in Monterey, where I now teach part-time. And so that website's available there. I recommend it for anybody who's interested. If you just go Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, you say Hinge Points Hecker, it will come up. And so I put all of that information together, all the open source stuff. I had an open source satellite imagery team at Stanford. I deal a lot with Jeffrey Lewis and company. I pay attention to what CSIS does. So my analysis, and particularly what went into the book, is from all of these sources, but not from the classified world.
Thank you, Sig. So we are now a minute past our shut-off time. Sharon and Frank, final comments?
Well, in light of the time, I won't offer any comments except to say this has been completely delightful. I'm thrilled you wrote this book, Sig, and I will admit I haven't read every single page, so I still have a few to look forward to. But thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Frank?
Sig, I'm sure that you have this photo on your website from your tour in 2004 of the radiochemical laboratory.
I do, and there's one Frank Jannuzi.
Hiding in back, and Keith Luse is back there too. He's behind your head, over your left shoulder, I believe, is Keith. But what struck me so much is how cold it was inside the building. We all have our coats and scarves on in January inside the radiochemical laboratory. But I want to thank you just for a wonderful book and a wonderful discussion today. And I hope that the hinge points that we face in the future with the DPRK will not all be crisis driven. I hope that at least some of them will be the result of innovative diplomacy and creative efforts to try to convince the DPRK that there's a pathway forward that does not involve the continued production and testing of nuclear weapons.
So Sharon, thank you. Frank, thank you. And thanks for the privilege of co-hosting with the Mansfield Foundation. I'd also like to thank Sayuri Romay from the foundation, as well as Ari Lee, Marissa McPherson from NCNK. And Sig, I must tell you that just special thanks for the contribution you have and continue to make in this area. For me, visiting Yongbyon with you was rather astounding in the sense of the level of respect that Director Rhee and his colleagues showed for you. Secondly, a number of them seemed surprised. You did not reflect the type of nasty American that they'd all been led to believe Americans were about. So you've done so much through your trips, through your personal interaction, to not only help diffuse the situation along the way, in my opinion, but also to convey an image of the United States that I think would make everyone proud. So thank you, and thanks to the audience for being with us today. Take care.
Thank you, Keith, Frank, Sharon. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.